Commander had been running disaster response simulations for 23 years. In all that time, across hundreds of species and thousands of trainees, they had never seen anything quite like the humans. The training station floated in orbit around a massive gas giant, its rings glittering in the distance. Inside the habitat ring, 50 recruits from a dozen different species worked through their final certification exercise. The scenario was simple enough. A mining colony had suffered catastrophic structural failure. Rescue the survivors, stabilize the structure, work as a team. Every species had their protocols. The beings with compound eyes and precise movements rotated out every 4 hours exactly. Their biology demanded it. The who breathed through gilled slits along their necks needed rest every 6 hours or their cognitive functions declined sharply. The crystalline beings who communicated through light pulses had to recharge after 8 hours of physical labor. These weren't suggestions. These were hard biological limits, programmed into every piece of emergency response software in the galaxy. Watch the exercise from the control room, their 4 arms moving across multiple displays. Everything was proceeding normally. Teams cycled in and out. Progress was steady. Then the alert started. Human Team Alpha has missed their scheduled rest period, the computer announced in its flat voice. Pulled up the feed. 3 humans in emergency response suits worked in the simulated collapse zone. Martinez and they'd been inside for 6 hours straight, hauling debris, stabilizing structural supports, coordinating with other teams. The computer had flagged them twice already. Human Team Alpha, you are overdue for mandatory rest cycle, said into the comm. Rotate out immediately. Just a few more minutes, Commander. Martinez's voice came back, slightly breathless. We've almost got this section cleared. Translator Chip struggled with the concept of just a few more minutes. It was imprecise, unscientific, but they'd learned that humans used such phrases constantly. Negative, rotate out now. That's an order. There was a pause, then's voice. Acknowledged, Commander. We'll finish this support beam and head out. Made a note in their report. Humans had difficulty following direct orders when they believed they were close to completing a task. It was the 5th time they'd noted this behavior. 3 hours later, the same team was still inside. Now they'd been working for 9 hours continuously. Their biometric readings showed elevated heart rates, increased respiration, and rising core temperatures. Any other species would have been pulled out by the safety systems automatically, but human physiology was strange. They operated in ranges that would indicate severe distress in other beings, yet they continued functioning. Human Team Alpha, you are now in violation of safety protocols, said, unable to keep the frustration from their voice. If you do not exit immediately, you will be disqualified from certification. Commander, we've got survivors in Section 7, responded. The thermal signatures are weak. If we leave now and wait for the next rotation, they might not make it. This is a simulation, reminded them. We know, sir, but we train like it's real or there's no point. Didn't have a response to that. They consulted the exercise parameters. The simulated survivors in Section 7 would indeed expire before the next rotation could reach them. That was by design. It was a lesson about resource allocation and acceptable losses. Every disaster response team had to learn that you couldn't save everyone. Apparently, no one had taught this to the humans. By hour 14, had stopped trying to order them out. The other species watched with a mixture of concern and confusion as the 3 humans continued working. They'd skipped 2 meals. They'd ignored 6 direct orders. Their vital signs were approaching what the medical database labeled as extreme distress. How are they still moving? Asked X, an observer who served as second. Their biological readings suggest they should have collapsed hours ago. I don't know, admitted. They pulled up the human medical files again, scanning through information that still made little sense. Something about persistence hunting and endurance adaptation. Human muscles apparently had two types of fibers. Their cooling system used water evaporation. Their brains could override pain signals. None of it explained what they were watching. Martinez was physically holding up a structural beam while worked to secure it, coordinated three other teams through the comm system while simultaneously treating a simulated casualty. They moved like people possessed, like stopping simply wasn't an option their minds would accept. "Commander, I recommend we halt the exercise," X said quietly. "The humans are going to hurt themselves." Was about to agree when Martinez stumbled. It was a small thing, barely noticeable. But then his legs gave out completely. He dropped to his knees, the structural beam crashing down beside him, rushed over, shouting into the comm for medical support. "End simulation," commanded. "Medical team to Section 7 immediately." The habitat lights changed from red alert to normal. The exercise was over. Medical personnel rushed in while an X hurried down from the control room. They found Martinez sitting against a wall, breathing hard. A medical scanner hovered over him, reading out statistics that made translators stutter trying to convert them to normal ranges. Severe dehydration, muscle exhaustion, critically low blood sugar. The human had quite literally worked until his body shut down. "I'm fine," Martinez said, waving away the concerned medics. "Just need some water and a protein bar." "You collapsed," said flatly. "Yeah, sorry about that, Commander. Lost my focus for a second there." "You worked for 16 hours straight. You ignored every safety protocol. You pushed your body past any reasonable limit." His four arms gestured in frustration. "This is exactly why I'm recommending that humans be removed from disaster response certification. You're a danger to yourselves and to your teammates." Stepped forward, her expression difficult to read behind her helmet. "With respect, Commander, we saved everyone. Every simulated casualty made it out. Our team plus the teams we coordinated. 100% success rate." "At what cost?" demanded. "One of you is down. In a real disaster, you would have become a casualty yourself. Another person someone else would have to rescue." "But in a real disaster, those people in Section 7 would be alive," said quietly. "That's worth something." Didn't have a response. They turned away, already composing the report in their mind. The humans were clearly unsuited for this work, too reckless, too unable to recognize their own limitations. They'd file the paperwork, the humans would be reassigned to some other role, and that would be the end of it. The report was half-written when the station's alarms started screaming. At first thought it was another simulation, but the control room was in chaos, multiple displays showing red warnings cascading across systems. A solar flare, massive and unpredicted, had struck the station's shields at exactly the wrong angle. Power fluctuations, structural stress, fires in 3 habitat sections. This wasn't a drill, this was real. "All personnel to emergency stations," commanded, their voice steady despite the fear coursing through them. "Deploy disaster response teams immediately. This is not a simulation. Repeat, this is not a simulation." The carefully planned rotation schedules meant nothing now. Every available person was needed. Coordinated teams directing them to the worst affected areas. The work their precise 4-hour shifts, then had to withdraw. The lasted 6 hours before their biology forced them to rest. The push to 8 hours, then their crystalline structures began to fracture from stress. One by one, species reached their limits and had to pull back. It was expected, it was planned for, but the disaster kept spreading. Fires needed fighting. Structural supports needed shoring up. People needed rescuing. And through it all, in every section, on every comm channel, heard the same 3 names. Martinez. The humans were everywhere. Martinez had been back on his feet 20 minutes after collapsing, with nothing but water and food. He was now in Section 3, pulling survivors from wreckage, was coordinating fire suppression in Section 5 while simultaneously directing structural repairs. was in Section 7, the same area they'd fought so hard to clear in the simulation, now doing it for real. Hours passed, the crisis continued, and the humans just kept going. Watched through smoke-filled cameras and failing sensors. Other species rotated out, rested, rotated back in. The humans didn't stop. They moved from crisis to crisis, from rescue to rescue, as if the concept of exhaustion didn't exist for them. It was hour 19 of the real disaster when finally found a moment to check the human bioreadings. What they saw should have been impossible. Martinez's body temperature was dangerously high. His heart rate had been elevated for so long that it should have caused permanent damage. His blood sugar levels were critically low. And yet they kept working. Stood in the control room, surrounded by exhausted personnel from a dozen species, and watched the three humans on the monitors. They moved slower now, their coordination less precise, but they moved, they worked, they continued. A strange thought occurred to them, one that contradicted everything they'd been about to write in their report. What if the humans weren't broken or defective? What if they were simply built for this? What if evolution on Earth had created a species that could push past every reasonable limit, that could work until they collapsed, that couldn't stop when others needed help? It was a terrifying thought, and as watched Martinez pull another survivor from the wreckage, they realized it was also the truth. The humans weren't unsuited for disaster response work. They were the only ones who truly were. 2 weeks later, stood on Earth's surface for the first time. The gravity was slightly higher than they preferred, and the atmosphere had an odd smell that their translator identified as ocean salt and growing things. They'd been sent to conduct a formal investigation into human safety violations during both the training exercise and the actual disaster. There would be reports, evaluations, recommendations. But standing there, looking up at the blue sky, wasn't sure what they were supposed to recommend anymore. Dr. Sarah met them at the Terran Disaster Response Institute, a sprawling complex built into the side of a mountain range. She was shorter than most humans had met, with dark skin and graying hair pulled back in a practical style. Her handshake was firm, another human custom that still felt strange. "Commander," she said with a smile, "welcome to Earth. I understand you have questions about why we're all so stubborn." "That's one way to phrase it," replied. Their translator struggled with the word stubborn, but eventually settled on persistent beyond reason. Doctor led them through the facility, training rooms where humans practiced rescue techniques, medical bays where injuries were treated, classrooms where theory was taught. It looked similar to facilities on a dozen other worlds, but Doctor wasn't taking them to see the buildings. She was taking them to understand something deeper. They stopped in a museum of sorts. Historical displays lined the walls. Doctor gestured to the first one. "This is how humans hunted thousands of years ago," she explained. The display showed primitive humans, barely recognizable as the same species, running across an open plain. "We weren't fast. We weren't strong, but we could run for days. We'd track an animal, chase it, let it rest, chase it again, over and over until it literally couldn't run anymore. We call it persistence hunting." Study the display. You exhausted your prey to death. Essentially, yes. Our bodies evolved for it. We sweat to cool down, which is rare among Earth species. We have specific muscle fibers for endurance. Our joints and tendons are designed for distance, not speed. We became the animal that just doesn't stop. They moved to the next display. Sailors on ancient ships working through storms. Humans building massive structures, hauling stone for years. Farmers working from sunrise to sunset. Soldiers marching for days without sleep. "It's not just hunting," Doctor continued. "It's everything. Human history is full of people who just kept going when any reasonable being would have stopped. Not because we're brave, necessarily, but because our brains literally have the ability to override our body's distress signals. We can decide to keep moving even when everything hurts. We can push through exhaustion using nothing but willpower." That sounds maladaptive, said. Why would evolution favor a species that ignores its own warning signs? Because sometimes survival means not stopping. Sometimes you have to get to shelter before the storm hits. Sometimes you have to finish the harvest before winter. Sometimes you have to keep fighting because surrender means death. Doctor's expression grew thoughtful. We're built for emergencies, Commander, for situations where stopping isn't an option. They walked through more displays, firefighters working through the night, medical personnel in disaster zones operating for days on stimulants and determination, rescue workers digging through rubble until their hands bled. The pattern repeated throughout human history, across every culture. Doctor led them outside to an observation deck overlooking a training ground. Below, human disaster response teams were running drills. Could see them working, pushing, driving themselves forward. Watch them, Doctor said. See that team on the left. They've been running for 6 hours. Their instructor will call for a rest period soon, and watch what happens. The instructor's whistle blew. The exercise paused. The humans were told to take 30 minutes for food and water, but noticed something strange. Several of them kept working. They took water bottles with them but continued checking equipment, discussing strategy, reviewing what went wrong. They can't fully stop, Doctor explained. Even when ordered to rest, part of their brain is still working the problem. We call it dedication, drive, work ethic, but really it's just how we're wired. Is there a limit? Asked, or do humans simply work until they die? Doctor was quiet for a moment. There's always a limit. We just have a hard time recognizing it until we hit it catastrophically. Come with me. I want to show you something else. They went to a medical wing. Here the atmosphere was different, quieter, more somber. Doctor showed them rooms where humans were recovering from disasters. Some had physical injuries. Others had wounds that weren't visible. This is the cost, Doctor said softly. PTSD, chronic pain, burnout. We can push ourselves past any reasonable limit, but that doesn't mean there's no price. Some of these people will never fully recover. They gave everything they had and it broke them. Met some of them. A firefighter who'd worked 3 days straight and now couldn't be near smoke without panic attacks. A medical responder who'd saved dozens of lives but couldn't save herself from the memories. A rescue worker with hands so from digging through debris that they'd never function normally again. So why do you keep doing it? Asked. Why not establish mandatory limits like every other species? Why not force yourselves to stop? Doctor smiled sadly. Because someone has to do it. Someone has to be willing to go past reasonable limits when the situation is unreasonable, and apparently we're the species that evolved to fill that role. They returned to Doctor's office, sat in a chair designed for multiple body types, their 4 arms folded thoughtfully. The investigation was supposed to be straightforward, document human violations, recommend removal from disaster response certification, file the report. But nothing about humans was straightforward. I came here to write a report recommending that your species be banned from disaster response work, admitted. I believed you were too reckless, too unable to recognize your own limitations. And now, Doctor asked. Now I don't know what to write. Pulled up data on their portable display. During the station disaster, humans made up 4% of available personnel but were responsible for 37% of successful rescues. They worked twice as long as any other species. They took risks that no one else would take. And yes, several of them required medical intervention afterward. But the survivors they pulled out are alive because humans don't know when to stop. Doctor leaned back in her chair. So what's your recommendation, Commander? Thought about Martinez, collapsing in the training exercise only to be back on his feet 20 minutes later. About coordinating multiple teams while fighting fires. About working in the same section they'd fought to clear in simulation, doing it for real when it mattered. I don't have one yet, admitted. How do you regulate beings who can override their own biology? How do you protect people who will sacrifice themselves without hesitation? How do you build protocols around unpredictability? Those are good questions, Doctor said. Questions we've been asking ourselves for centuries. Want to know what answers we've found? Please. Not many. We train. We try to teach restraint and self-awareness. We monitor each other. We build in mandatory checks and balances. But at the end of the day, if there's someone who needs help and a human thinks they can reach them, they're going to try. It's not heroism. It's not stupidity. It's just what we do. Portable display chimed. An urgent message from the Galactic Disaster Response Council. They read it, their expression darkening. There's been an incident, they said quietly. A passenger liner collided with an asteroid in the 442 system. Massive casualties. They're assembling disaster response teams from all available stations. They looked up at Doctor. They're requesting human volunteers specifically. 3 per team, embedded with mixed species units. Doctor stood up. How many volunteers do they need? 73. We can have 100 ready in 6 hours. Even knowing what it will cost them, asked. Doctor walked to the window, looking out at the training grounds where humans were still working. Especially knowing that, Commander, because that's the other thing you need to understand about humans. We know the cost. We pay it anyway, every single time. Watched the humans training below. They thought about the investigation report, still unfinished, about safety protocols and reasonable limits, about species that knew when to stop and one species that didn't. And they realized the question had never been whether humans should be banned from disaster response work. The question was whether the galaxy could afford not to have them when everything went wrong. I'll go with the volunteers, decided. Complete my investigation in the field. Doctor smiled. Fair warning, Commander. Once you see humans working a real large-scale disaster, you'll never look at emergency response the same way again. I'm beginning to suspect that's already happened, replied. 6 hours later, they were on a transport ship with 73 human volunteers, heading toward the 442 system. Martinez, and were among them, of course, still healing from the station disaster, already volunteering for the next one. Watched them prepare their equipment, saw the determination in their movements, and wondered what they were about to witness. The wreckage of the infinite horizon tumbled through space like a broken toy. The luxury liner had been carrying 4,000 passengers when it struck the asteroid. Now it was 3 separate pieces, each spinning slowly, life support failing, time running out. Commander coordinated the response from the crisis coordination ship, surrounded by representatives from 40 different species. Screens showed damage assessments, casualty estimates, and resource allocation. The mathematics were brutal but necessary. In any disaster, you calculated how many you could save versus how many you could afford to lose. It was the nature of emergency response across the galaxy. Standard protocol allowed 48 hours for extraction. After that, the risk to rescuers exceeded the probability of finding additional survivors. It wasn't cruel. It was logical. Resources were finite. Personnel had limits. You saved who you could, then before losing more rescuers than victims. The human volunteers were distributed across the teams, 3 per unit, embedded with and other species. 73 humans in total. Martinez and led different teams. Could track them all on the command display, small dots of biological data moving through the wreckage. The first 24 hours proceeded according to plan. Teams cycled in and out of the wreckage on schedule. The worked their precise 4-hour shifts. The rotated every 6 hours. The managed 8. Progress was steady. Survivors were extracted, medical personnel standing by, everything running smoothly. The humans stood out, of course. They volunteered for the most dangerous extractions. They worked through their scheduled rest periods. They had to be reminded to eat and drink. But the mixed species teams functioned well. The humans provided the endurance. The other species provided the restraint. It balanced out. Then at hour 31, everything went wrong. Secondary explosions ripped through the second piece of the wreckage. Debris scattered across the operational zone, making approach vectors deadly. Automated systems recalculated risk factors. The numbers changed rapidly, red warnings flashing across every display. "All teams, this is command," announced. "We have new casualties in Sector 3, but approach is now high risk. Life support in Sector 2 is failing faster than projected. We're accelerating the timeline." More calculations, more mathematics. The acceptable loss threshold had shifted. Consulted with the other commanders, checked the resource allocation, reviewed the extraction schedules. The conclusion was unavoidable. "All teams, prepare for full withdrawal," commanded. "Protocol requires we extract remaining personnel within the next 6 hours. Prioritize critical cases. We'll do what we can, but we cannot risk additional rescuer casualties." The acknowledgments came in from every team. The confirmed, the confirmed, the confirmed. Every species understood. You couldn't save everyone. That was the hardest lesson in disaster response, but it was also the most important. Then Martinez's voice came through the comm. "Commander, we're picking up life signs in Section 3C 57 signatures. They're weak, but they're there. We can reach them." Pulled up the section data. 3C was in the third piece of wreckage, the most damaged section. The approach vector was through the new debris field. Life support was at 14% and dropping. The extraction window was minutes, not hours. "Negative, Martinez. The risk is too high. Begin withdrawal procedures with the rest of your team." There was a pause, then, "Acknowledged, Commander." Watched the display. Martinez's team began moving, but not toward the extraction point. They were heading deeper into the wreckage, toward Section 3C. "Martinez, you're going the wrong direction. I ordered withdrawal." "I know, sir, but there are 57 people in 3C. We're going to get them." "That's a direct order, Martinez. Withdraw immediately." "Understood, Commander. We'll withdraw once we have those 57 people." Before could respond, other human voices came through the comm. His team was refusing extraction. So was. Across the operational zone, human volunteers were acknowledging the withdrawal order, then completely ignoring it. "What are they doing?" X demanded from the adjacent station. "Why aren't they following orders?" Thought back to the Terran Disaster Response Institute, to Dr. words. If there's someone who needs help and a human thinks they can reach them, they're going to try. "They're being human," said quietly. The next 16 hours were the longest of life. They watched helplessly as the human teams worked through impossibly dangerous conditions. Every other species had withdrawn. Every sensible being was safely back on the rescue ships. The mathematics clearly stated that additional rescues weren't worth the risk. But mathematics didn't account for humans. Martinez's team jury-rigged cutting equipment that should have failed an hour ago. His group navigated through debris fields that made veteran pilots nervous just watching. Coordinated extractions through sections of the ship that were actively decompressing. The humans moved like they didn't understand the meaning of impossible. Their biometric data was terrifying. Heart rates elevated for hours. Core temperatures dangerous. Exhaustion levels that should have caused collapse. Watched the numbers climb. Watched the humans push further past their limits than they had during the station disaster. "Commander, we need to order an emergency extraction," X insisted. "The humans are killing themselves out there." "They won't comply," said. "Then we send teams in to physically retrieve them." "And risk those teams too," gestured at the displays. "Besides, look at what they're doing. Look at who they're saving." His team had just pulled out a family from a collapsed section. The parents and 3 children, all alive because had crawled through a gap barely large enough for her body. His group was extracting a cluster that had been presumed lost when their section lost power. Martinez was in Section 3C, his team working systematically through the life signs, pulling out survivors one by one. Other species watched from the rescue ships. They who valued logic and precision above all else couldn't understand what they were seeing. The who believed in acceptance of inevitable loss were openly confused. The who made decisions based on probability matrices found the entire situation paradoxical. But they all watched, and slowly something shifted. A volunteer approached. "Commander, request permission to re-enter the operational zone. You've exceeded your work limit. I've rested for 6 hours. I'm capable of another shift. The humans need support." Before could respond, more volunteers came forward, who should have been exhausted, who'd already pushed past their normal limits. Species from a dozen different worlds, all asking to go back in. "You understand this violates protocol?" asked. "Yes, Commander," the replied, "but the humans are teaching us that sometimes protocol isn't enough." Made a decision that would probably end their career. All volunteers who feel capable of another shift prepare for deployment. Support the human teams, but anyone who reaches their limit, you withdraw immediately. That's non-negotiable. The rescue operation continued. Now it wasn't just humans working past exhaustion. Other species pushed themselves further than they ever had before. Not as far as the humans, that seemed to be a unique capability, but further than protocol allowed, further than was strictly logical. Hour 43. Martinez's team extracted the last survivor from Section 3C, 57 souls, all alive. His group finished clearing Section 2B, finding 12 more people than initial scans had suggested. Coordinated a massive extraction from a structural pocket that should have been checked off as inaccessible. Hour 47. The final human teams began withdrawal. They moved slowly now, their coordination degraded by exhaustion. Several had to be physically assisted by the non-human volunteers. Martinez was barely conscious. Suit had to compensate for her failing balance. His voice over the comm was slurred with fatigue. But they came out, all 73 humans, all alive. The medical bay was overwhelmed. Humans on stretchers, hooked to IV fluids, being scanned and treated for a dozen different stress-related conditions. 4 required immediate surgery. Martinez was placed in a medical coma to let his body recover from the extreme exhaustion. Had stress fractures in both legs from working too long in high-gravity sections. Kidneys were approaching failure from dehydration. Walked through the medical bay, looking at the humans who'd sacrificed so much. Every one of them was grounded for at least a month of recovery. Some would need physical therapy. Others would need psychological support. The cost was enormous. But so was the result. 203 additional survivors beyond what protocol had allowed for. 203 beings who were alive because humans didn't understand the concept of acceptable losses. The investigation report practically wrote itself now. Sat in their quarters, 4 arms moving across the display, composing the recommendations that would change how the galaxy approached disaster response forever. The report detailed everything. The human biology that allowed for extreme endurance, the psychological factors that prevented them from stopping, the costs they paid for their inability to recognize limits, and most importantly, the results they achieved when everything else had failed. The recommendations were revolutionary. Official inclusion of human volunteers in all major disaster response operations. But also, Protocol Zero, human-specific guidelines that acknowledged both their unique capabilities and their dangerous inability to self-regulate. Mandatory extraction of humans after set time limits, regardless of their protests. Dedicated medical teams for each human volunteer. Psychological screening before and after operations. Override authority for non-human commanders to physically restrain humans who refuse to withdraw. steep penalties for humans who violated the new protocols. It was a framework designed to harness human endurance while protecting them from themselves. 3 weeks later, presented the report to the Galactic Disaster Response Council. Representatives from hundreds of species filled the chamber. The presentation took 2 hours, showed the data, the biological assessments, the cost-benefit analyses. When they finished, the chamber was silent. Finally, a counselor spoke. "You're asking us to officially sanction behavior that violates every safety protocol we've established. I'm asking you to recognize that humans operate outside those protocols whether we sanction it or not," replied. Protocol Zero doesn't encourage their recklessness. It manages it. It protects them while allowing them to do what they do best. "And what is that exactly?" a counselor asked. "Save people who everyone else has given up on." The vote was unanimous. Protocol Zero passed with full endorsement. Human volunteers would be officially integrated into disaster response teams across the galaxy. The new safety protocols would be implemented immediately. As the session ended, an elderly counselor approached. Their crystalline body pulsed with dim light, indicating deep thought. "Commander, I have a question about your report. You documented extensively what happens when humans refuse to stop. But what happens when there's no one left to stop them? What happens when the disaster is so large that they all collapse before it's finished?" Had thought about this question many times since leaving Earth. I don't have an answer, but I suspect humans would say it doesn't matter. Someone has to try, someone has to keep going. Even if it kills them. Especially then, that's what makes them human. This light pulsed thoughtfully. Perhaps that's what makes them necessary. 6 months later, received a message from Doctor. Attached was a photo from Earth, taken at a memorial for disaster response volunteers. Humans stood alongside and dozens of other species, all wearing memorial badges, all remembering those who hadn't come back. The message was brief. Protocol Zero is working. We're saving more people, losing fewer volunteers. The galaxy is learning from us, but more importantly, we're learning from them. They're teaching us that limits exist for a reason. We're teaching them that sometimes you have to push past limits to do what's right. It's a good trade. Looked at the photo for a long time. Then they filed it with their investigation report, a reminder of what they'd learned. Humans were reckless and stubborn and unable to recognize their own limits. They worked until they collapsed. They ignored orders. They took risks that made sense only to them. And the galaxy was better for having them. Martinez had recovered from his medical coma and was already back in training. His legs had healed, though she'd always walk with a slight limp. Kidneys had recovered, but he'd been warned that one more incident like that might cause permanent damage. All three had immediately volunteered for the next disaster response mission. Because that was what humans did. They kept going when everyone else stopped. They pushed past every reasonable limit. They refused to accept that some people couldn't be saved. And slowly, impossibly, that trait was spreading. Other species were learning to push just a little further than they thought possible, to take risks that protocol said weren't justified, to believe that maybe, just maybe, one more rescue was worth trying for. The galaxy was learning to be stubborn. Wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a terrifying thing, probably both. But as they prepared for their next assignment, coordinating mixed species teams that included human volunteers, found themselves thinking something they never had before. Maybe acceptable losses didn't have to be so acceptable after all. Maybe someone should always try. And if humans were the ones who'd teach the galaxy that lesson, well, that seemed somehow fitting. They were, after all, the species.